In 2015, a group of researchers did something unusual. They didn't run an experiment. They read papers. Specifically, they examined 703 published papers from leading physiology and neuroscience journals and looked at a single feature of each one. What kind of graph did the authors use to present their preliminary results? The finding was stark. In more than half the papers, the primary figure was a bar graph. 2 or more bars showing group means with error bars on top. And the researchers, Natasha Weissgerber and her colleagues, made an argument that is still making its way through the discipline. Those graphs were hiding the data. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but structurally. A bar graph by design shows you almost nothing. It shows you the height of a mean and the length of an error bar. Everything else, the shape of the distribution, the sample size, the spread of individual scores, the presence of outliers, whether there are subgroups responding differently, is invisible. And that invisibility, Weissgerber argued, has real scientific consequences. Let me be precise about this. A standard bar graph communicates 2 things: the mean of each group, represented by the height of the bar, and some measure of variability, usually what's called the standard error or confidence interval, represented by the error bars on top. The standard error, if you haven't encountered it yet, is the standard deviation divided by the square root of the sample size. That's worth pausing on. The standard deviation tells you how spread out the individual scores are. The standard error tells you something different, how precisely the mean has been estimated. A study with 100 participants will have a smaller standard error than a study with 10, even if the underlying spread of scores is identical, because more data give you a more reliable estimate of the mean. We'll build this concept up properly in week 7 when we get to sampling distributions. For now, the key point is simply that the error bar on a bar graph is not the same thing as the standard deviation. It's a measure of the mean's reliability, not the data's spread. That's it. Everything else you might want to know about the data, how many participants contributed to that mean, whether they were tightly clustered around it or spread across a wide range, whether there were subgroups responding differently, whether a few extreme values are pulling the mean in one direction, none of that is visible. You're looking at a single number dressed up as a picture. And the problem is that bar graphs look authoritative. They look like the data have been examined and the key findings extracted. So readers don't ask what's underneath them. They read the height of the bar and move on. This wouldn't be a problem if the mean were always a reliable description of the data. But as we discussed in the last lecture, the mean can be completely misleading when the distribution is skewed, bimodal, or driven by outliers. In those situations, the bar graph is not just uninformative, it's actively misleading because it implies the data are more well-behaved than they are. Here is the critical demonstration from Weissgerber's paper. I want you to really sit with this. Imagine a bar graph, 2 bars. The treatment bar is higher than the control bar by a consistent amount. Both bars have modest error bars. The graph looks like a clean, moderate treatment effect. Now consider 4 completely different data sets that all produce exactly that bar graph. The same bar heights, the same error bars. In dataset 1, both groups follow roughly normal distributions. The data are symmetric, reasonably spread, and well-behaved. The bar graph represents the data fairly. The mean is reasonably a summary of the typical score. Dataset 2, the treatment group is bimodal. Some participants responded strongly to the treatment. Others barely responded at all. There are 2 distinct clusters of scores, and the mean sits between them in a region where relatively few people actually scored. The bar graph is reporting the average of a mixture, not the outcome for a homogeneous group. The correct scientific conclusion isn't the treatment has a moderate effect, but that the treatment has a large effect for some people and almost no effect for others. The bar graph reports the first. The distribution reveals the second. Dataset 3. The treatment group contains a small number of extremely high scores that pull the mean upward. Remove those 3 or 4 participants and the treatment group mean drops to roughly the same level as the control group. The apparent effect is real in a narrow arithmetic sense. The mean really is higher, but it's driven by outliers rather than a consistent treatment response. The bar graph cannot tell you this. A dot plot showing every data point would tell you immediately. And then there's dataset 4. The entire dataset contains only 8 participants, 4 per group. The bar graph looks identical to dataset 1, but it's built on 4 observations per condition. A single participant shifting their response could reverse the result entirely. Without being shown the individual data points, you have no way to know that the study is that small. 4 datasets, 1 bar graph. The graph cannot distinguish between them. If you encountered any of these 4 papers and saw only the bar graph, you would form the same impression of all 4. You would note the direction of the effect, estimate its size from the bar height, and draw a conclusion without knowing whether you were looking at a clean, normal distribution result, a mixed response artifact, an outlier-driven finding, or a study too small to support any inference. This is not an aesthetic complaint about graph quality. It's an argument about how we reason. When you look at a bar graph, you form an impression of the data. You judge the size of the effect. You assess whether it seems convincing or fragile. And that impression shapes how seriously you take the finding, whether you cite it and whether you build subsequent work on it. But that impression is built on almost no information. 2 numbers, a mean and a standard error, and everything else is concealed. The concealment matters because distributions shape interpretations. If the treatment group is bimodal, the appropriate conclusion changes completely. If the result is driven by outliers, the replication probability is much lower than the clean bar graph suggests. If the sample is tiny, the apparent effect could easily just be noise. In each case, the bar graph creates overconfidence. It presents a compressed picture that looks like solid evidence, and readers respond to it as solid evidence because they don't know what's underneath. Weissgerber's paper is part of a broader argument in science about the gap between what gets published and what is actually in the data. Unreported distributions are one place where that gap lives. Here's a scenario. A published paper reports a comparison between a treatment group and a control group using a bar graph. The treatment bar is higher. The error bars don't overlap. The paper concludes that the treatment significantly improved outcomes. You obtain the raw data. When you plot a dot plot of the treatment group, you see 10 participants clustered around 40 and 3 participants with scores above 90. The control group forms a single cluster around 30. What does the dot plot reveal that the bar graph didn't? The dot plot shows that the apparent treatment effect is driven primarily by 3 very high-scoring participants. Without those 3, the treatment group mean would sit much closer to the control group, close enough that the significant difference might disappear. The bar graph reported the mean of a mixed distribution as though it represented a consistent effect. The dot plot makes the structure of the data visible and raises a question the bar graph didn't allow. Are those 3 outliers genuine treatment responders or anomalies? The bar graph cannot ask that question. The dot plot makes it unavoidable. So what should researchers use instead? Weissgerber and colleagues proposed a set of alternatives that reveal what bar graphs hide. These tools you'll use in Jamovi, so it's worth understanding what each one does. The simplest alternative is the dot plot, also called a strip chart or a jitter plot. You plot every data point individually. Every participant is a dot. You see immediately how many data points there are, how they're distributed, whether they're clustered tightly or spread wide, and whether there are outliers. For small samples, say 20 to 30 participants per group, this is often the most honest graph you can make. Nothing is hidden because everything is shown. For larger samples, where individual points might overlap and make it really hard to read, violin plots are more informative. A violin plot shows the full distribution of scores as a smoothed shape, wider where scores are common, narrower where they're rare. The outline of the violin gives you the shape of a distribution at a glance. A violin with a single wide belly in the middle is approximately normal. A violin with two distinct bulges is bimodal. A violin that's wide at the bottom and narrow at the top is right skewed. You can overlay a box plot or individual data points on the violin to add the median, the quartiles, and the specific outliers. And then there are box plots with overlaid data. These sit between the other two options. They combine the compact summary of a box plot, median, interquartile range, whiskers, identified outliers, with the transparency of individual data points plotted on top. You get both the summary and the raw observations. This is often the single most informative two-group comparison you can produce. Each of these options reveals something different, but all of them share one property the bar graphs lack. They show you the structure of the data, not just a compression of it. This is where Jamovi becomes more than a calculation tool. When you open a dataset in Jamovi and navigate to the exploration module, you can generate histograms, density plots, box plots, and violin plots directly. You can overlay raw data points on distributions. You can see the shape of your data before you run any test. The habit to build is this. Every time you work with a dataset in this course, the first thing you do is visualize it. Not compute means, not run statistical tests. Visualize. Generate the histogram. Produce the box plot. Look at the shape, the spread, the outliers, and whether there's any hint of subgroups before you ask any inferential questions. This changes what you notice in your own results. Instead of looking at a p-value and deciding whether or not the treatment worked, you look at the distribution and ask, worked for whom, by how much, and with what kind of consistency? Those are better questions, and the visualization gives you the information to ask them. Here's the deeper point I want you to carry out of this lecture. When a researcher chooses to present their data as a bar graph rather than a violin plot or a dot plot, that is not a neutral aesthetic decision. It is a choice about what to show and what to conceal. Sometimes that choice is made for reasons of convention. Bar graphs are what everyone uses in the field, so they become the default, unreflective option. Sometimes it's made for legitimate, practical reasons. The data really are simple enough that a bar graph is adequate, and a violin plot adds nothing. And sometimes it's made because the distribution tells a more complicated story than the mean does, and a bar graph flattens that complication to something that looks cleaner than it is. The reader who doesn't know this is exposed. They look at a bar graph and believe they've seen the data. They haven't. They've seen a summary of a summary. The reader who does know this asks different questions. Every time you encounter a bar graph in a paper from now on, the question to ask is, what would this look like as a violin plot? What would I see if the raw data were shown? Is there any reason to suspect the distribution is telling a different story than the mean? That question, what am I not seeing, is one of the most useful diagnostic habits in your development as a researcher. It doesn't require access to the raw data. It just requires knowing that the bar graph isn't the whole picture, and being willing to notice what's missing. Let me connect this to where we've been in this course. In week 4, we talked about the gap between what a study's design supports and the claims made about it, between evidence and interpretation. In week 3, we talked about the gap between a psychological construct and the measure used to capture it. Now in week 6, we're talking about the gap between data and the graph used to represent it. They're all the same structural problem. Every layer of representation involves choices. Every compression involves loss. And the job of the critical reader and the responsible researcher is to know where the losses happen and whether they matter. Visualizing data properly is not about making prettier figures for publication. It's about closing the gap between what you actually found and the impression you give the reader. When you choose a violin plot over a bar graph, you're not being pedantic. You're being honest. You're saying, here is the structure of what I found, not just its average. And when you read a paper that shows only bar graphs, you now know to ask what's underneath them. Both interactive tools from this week, the Distribution Explorer and the Visualization Explorer, are linked on the course page and in the links below here at YouTube. I'd encourage you to spend a few minutes with the bar graph problem tab before the week 6 workshop. Work through all 4 datasets. The point lands differently when you're clicking through it yourself. So here's where we are. You can now look at data. You can see distributions, recognize shapes, understand what spread means, and identify when a graph might be concealing something important. You know that the bar graph and the violin plot are not interchangeable. They tell different amounts of the story. But there's still a question we haven't answered. Even when you can see the distribution clearly, even when the picture is honest, you still don't know how much to trust what you're seeing. Suppose the treatment group really does have a higher mean than the control group. The violin plots look clean. The distributions are roughly normal. How do you know that difference is real? How do you know it isn't just some random variation you'd expect from sampling different people? That's the question that takes us into inferential statistics. And it starts with a deceptively simple idea, the sampling distribution. I'll see you in week 7. Bye.